Bonsoir, tous et toutes, and welcome to the 2023 Global Ideas Lecture. My name is Michael Williams. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Public International Affairs, and it is my happy privilege to be the first person setting the course of events for this evening. I'd like to start, as is our custom here at the University of Ottawa, by paying respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. The Global Ideas Lecture is a collaboration between the University Chair on Global and Political Thought and the Center for International Policy Studies. I'd like to thank the university and the Faculty of Social Sciences for their support, but most of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. We held the first lecture last year with Professor Michael Ignatieff on the university and free speech, and we had to do it virtually. So it is absolutely an absolute pleasure to see everyone here in person and to be able to gather for this lecture for what is actually the first time in person. The Global Ideas Lectures are based on a very, very simple idea, and that is that ideas matter, and that ideas matter perhaps more at this point in history than they have in some time. As the international environment is shifting, as global forces are changing, ideas and debate about ideas are playing absolutely crucial roles in the unfolding world order and in struggles over its direction. The lecture is animated by the idea that contestation is crucial in this environment, that a desire to stimulate debate, to provoke, not necessarily to antagonize, but at the very least to unsettle fixed assumptions is essential if we're going to react and relate to our historical moment effectively. And I'm extremely confident that our second annual lecture will fit this bill to a T. On that note, I would like to hand the floor over to Professor Rita Abrahamson, the Director of the Center for International Policy Studies, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
As a small person, I will have to do some stage rearrangements. I would like to add my very warm welcome to all of you. It is a pleasure, as Michael said, to see so many of you here today for the 2023 Annual Global Ideas Lecture. It is no coincidence, no accident that this year's lecture is focused on Africa and Africa's place in the global circuit of ideas. Africa is increasingly at the center of contemporary world politics. And there is, I think, a growing realization of the continent's centrality to the future of humanity. By 2020, 1 in every 4 humans will be African. For the last 20 years or so, about half of the world's fastest growing economies have been African. The continent of Africa is home to 30% of the critical minerals that power the modern world, and it's also home to some very vast and beautiful ecosystems that we will need for the survival of the planet. Africa's 54 states hold more than a quarter of the votes at the UN General Assembly and 3 of the Security Council's non-permanent seats. And I think if anyone was ever in doubt about Africa's power, it has been illustrated in the last year in the debates around Russia's invasion in Ukraine. Yet, despite all of this importance, we hear far, far too little about African ideas, about Africa's political agency and their importance in shaping the past, the present, and the future of world politics. This evening's speaker, however, has long been at the forefront of highlighting the importance of African ideas and African intellectual production. And it is my honor tonight to introduce Professor Olufemi Taiwo as this year's Global Ideas speaker. Professor Taiwo is a professor of African political thought at the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University, where he has for several years now, dedicated himself to expand the African reach in philosophy and simultaneously to indigenize the discipline and make it more relevant to Africa and to African students. Prior to coming to Cornell, he taught at various universities in the US and also at the Obafemi Awolowo University at Ile-Ife in Nigeria. And before that, he did his doctoral studies at the University of Toronto. So he is no stranger to Canada. And I should add that last night when we had our final, hopefully, winter storm and snow was descending on Ottawa, I was grateful that this was not his first time in Ottawa and in Canada. Professor Taiwo is the author of numerous important books and articles, too many for me to list all of them tonight. But all of these books and articles are within the fields of social and political philosophy, the philosophy of law, and African philosophy. And I think if there is a common thread throughout these different works, it's the importance of modernity, of justice, equity, and human dignity. His book, How Colonialism Preempted Modernity in Africa, was published in 2010 and was awarded the Frantz Fanon Prize in 2015. His next book was Africa Must Be Modern, a manifesto, and this is a pretty hard-hitting argument in favor of modernity. And this was, of course, followed by his most recent book, Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously. So, as you can probably tell from this title of his various books, Professor Taiwo is not a professor who is merely content with reproducing established ideas, but instead he seeks to challenge them and to make us think harder and more critically. While one of the endorsements of this book describes it as launching a trench war, I'm tending to think about it in a little bit more positive terms, as a sincere invitation to engage seriously with the breadth, the depth, and the complexity of African scholars, of the African library, and thus to expand our commonwealth of ideas and knowledge. The idea at the center of this book, decolonization, has of course become a very powerful trope within academic discourse in the last few years, a powerful charge against the universality and the dominance of Western knowledge and its role in maintaining the alleged inequalities between the North and the South, and more specifically, between Africa and the so-called West. We are thus asked, in the name of decolonization, to decolonize the curriculum, to decolonize the disciplines, to decolonize the university. The list could go on. Let's decolonize. But what Professor Taiwo asks is, what does decolonization really mean? He invites us, I think, to take this question seriously and to reflect upon the question of whether or not decolonization really serves African empowerment and whether it helps to advance the contribution of African intellectuals to the improvement not only of Africa, but of humanity. These, I think, are some of the core questions in the book, and Professor Taiwo will talk about this book in his lecture tonight, which is called Against Decolonization on Africa's Place in the Global Circuit of Ideas. So please join me in welcoming Professor Taiwo to CIPS and the University of Ottawa.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Your first cultural lesson. I come from a place where when you greet, you expect to be greeted back. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much for obliging me. I would like to begin by expressing my profound gratitude to Professor Rita Abramson, the director of the Center for International Policy Studies, for her kind and generous invitation, and just a few minutes ago, very generous introduction for me to be part of this ongoing conversation in this university. I'm honored to have been invited, and I'm very, very glad to be here. I'm also grateful to Anna Bogish. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you. Who has been the person largely responsible for facilitating my journey here. I always tell people when I hold events at my institution that when you see me, as we say in my original language, my almost dragonfly that is dancing on the surface of the water, the drummer is beneath the water. The honors are those who are beneath the water, and they make us shine. And for that, I can never thank them enough. So thank you very much for making this happen. To the rest of the team that I may not have encountered directly in the process, please accept my heartfelt gratitude for making this meeting possible. When all is said and done, however, what will a lecture be without an audience? And as I always again like to point out, may you never throw a party that nobody comes to. I've seen it happen. So I know of what I speak. So that you all showed up tonight is an honor, is a tribute, and I cannot thank you enough for showing up and deciding to spend your scarce time with me. I can't promise you anything. I always work my butt to justify your time. I may not succeed, but trust me, it will not be for lack of trying. So thank you all very much for showing up. What does it matter what, if any, place Africa has in the global circuit of ideas? And why should anyone be exercised by this question? Before I answer the question, let me point out that I am not unmindful of problems that pertain to seeming to treat Africa as a unit of analysis. This is merely a pragmatic move on my part, designed nonetheless to alert us to the dangers of viewing, addressing, or studying the continent as if it were a single place marked by simple realities. I can only hope that what I say going forward underscores the complexities of life and thought on the continent. Be you an academic, a researcher, a policymaker, politician, diplomat, or a part of the NGO bureaucracy, especially of the variety that pervades poverty pornography, masked as aid appeals on television. I have no doubt that how you understand your relationship to the continent and its myriad phenomena is influenced, minimally speaking, by how you think of Africa in the global scheme of things, either through history or in the present time. For instance, if you permit yourself, wittingly or unwittingly, to think of Africa as a single continuum of peoples and cultures, with more convergences than divergences in their myriad presentations, you are more than likely to affirm as similar what, on closer examination, may turn out to be very unlike, if not totally incommensurable with one another. If again, you think of Africa and Africans as different from other places and other humans, respectively, your take on what Africa is and what Africans are and how you should relate to them will reflect this standpoint. The subtitle of my talk today speaks directly to these possibilities. In all what I just iterated, ideas are central to them, and such ideas all form part of what I call the global circuit of ideas. In Against Decolonization, Taking African Agency Seriously, the book that furnishes the basis for my talk here this evening, I identified two senses of decolonization. I call them decolonization subscript 1 and decolonization subscript 2, respectively. The first refers to the process through which a place or a people that had been under colonial subjection become free of their colonial rulers and assume responsibility for directing the course of their lives under their own agency again. I argue that this is an idea of decolonization that is very easy to establish, can easily be verified, and has demonstrable consequences for the lives of the decolonized. In the literature, especially when it comes to Africa, this is what is often called, derided is a better word, flag independence. Derided because many in the decolonizing industry, that's what I call them all kinds of names now. And that is the most generous that I can use. In other interviews, I've called them a cult, and it is a cult. And I may not be able to explain that right now, but maybe during question time, if you press me on that, I'll explain it to you and you'll see how cults work. That's how they work. Because many in the decolonizing industry, that is what it has become, and quite a thriving and very lucrative one. If you ask me, insist that this flag independence was an incomplete decolonization because the countries are still very much under the thumb of their erstwhile colonial overlords. And this is to be seen not just in the continuing control of the politics and economics of the former colonies, but more importantly, in the continuing overbearing impact of colonial ideas, practices, and processes on the culture, expansively conceived, of the nominally independent countries. This latter is what I have styled decolonization 2, subscript 2. On this alternative conception, in the aftermath of the original decolonization, the ex-colonized must not evince, much less embrace, elements of life and thought that are traceable to the colonizers or were part of colonial misrule while such lasted in the relevant territories. This is the decolonization that I'm convinced is incoherent and has no significant value when it comes to our making sense of the life and times of the ex-colonized, and therefore must be expunged from our discourse. So in essence, I do not see anything positive in this second sense of decolonization. Among other reasons that I offered in the book, one stands out for purposes of today's discussion. Once one embraces the prohibition of laying hold of any artifacts from the colonial repertoire, and at the same time, the bastard, that's what I call it in the book, periodization, that turns colonialism into the singular pole for periodizing the history of the African continent, one immediately settles behind a wall that makes it impossible to reach beyond it to the complexity and unbrokenness of Africa's place in the global circuit of ideas. I am convinced, as I have said in several discussions since my book came out, what the decolonizing industry is doing in Africa at this time, when it comes to scholarship and its future, borders on the criminal. And what I mean by that is the energies of young scholars are being dissipated into chasing slides and trying to correct people who, from my experience in this racket, either are very hard of hearing or are absolutely incapable of hearing. And if you are a new PhD in 2021, and you are still fighting battles that I was fighting as a graduate student in Canada in 1985, you are doing something very wrong with your time. And the sooner you give up on it, the better. That is my point. And I wrote this book for 3 categories of people. No, I did not write it for decolonizers. They are beyond conversation with people like me. So I wrote it for, 1, students and younger people who do not think that this sits well with them, but are too afraid to say so because they think that they will run afoul of their teachers. 2, for those who think this is absolute BS, but they are too afraid to come out and say so, either because they are not as rash as I am if they look like me, or if they look different, they are too afraid that they're going to be called names for calling it out. 3, I write it for those who are uneasy with the idea, but don't know what exactly it is that they are uneasy about. So if my book serves these 3 constituencies, my job is done. That means that I don't expect decolonizers to take it on because there's nothing in it for them. But if they do, and I hope I have some in the audience, I'm always ready to engage. This is where the framing for today's discussion becomes important. It is a question that exercises decolonizers no less than it does me. We differ profoundly in how we answer it. And here's the question. Why doesn't the world beat its path to Africa's doors when it comes to intellectual engagement? What I mean by that is, from my experience, Africa is never really taken seriously as a place of intellectual engagement. It is rather a place where people go to serve their consciences, to put some deposit in their karma account for later by going there to dig latrines, as if Africans cannot dig their own latrines. I used to say this because I used to teach at a school where they had a very strong tradition of sending students who don't take classes on Africa to go do, aid work. And then I say to people, I want to teach students about Africa. And when they go to Africa, they go as part of their cultural literacy program and study with people in Africa. And over the years, some of my colleagues said, oh, we know when your students show up in our classes because they are the ones who ask the right questions. So I said, that's my job. And I tell people, if you want to go dig latrines, good for you, but I'm not your teacher. I'm only interested in you if you really want to learn about Africa. And when you do, you may find out that indeed, getting on your government's case here might be what is needed so that you don't have to go dig latrines there. Why doesn't the world beat its path to Africa's doors when it comes to intellectual engagement? To finding African insights into the human condition beyond those compelled by pity for the prostrate condition of poor Africans, to identifying, studying, and arguing with African answers to the perennial questions of philosophy. Why is Africa-inflected knowledge produced by African scholars, whether in Africa or its growing new diaspora, not reckoned with, referenced, or engaged by others, both in and outside academia the world over? I have always been concerned by the erasure of African-produced knowledges in global discourses, even those concerning Africa. In this lecture, I argue that some of the causes can be traced to some of the motivations behind the decolonization scholarship that I ask that we dispense with in my book. Here is an idea of what this question entails. Aimé Césaire long ago lamented the recognition of Africa's place in the global circuit of ideas, and I quote him, "At the time we began to write, people could write a history of world civilization without devoting a single chapter to Africa, as if Africa had made no contributions to the world. Therefore, we affirmed that we were Negroes and that we were proud of it, and that we thought that Africa was not some sort of blank page in the history of humanity. In sum, we asserted that our Negro heritage was worthy of respect, and that this heritage was not relegated to the past, that its values were values that could still make an important contribution to the world." And the last sentence is very important because in an interview later, he goes on to say that these values are universal, and that when they were doing negritude, they were trying to universalize those African values. So to all those decolonizers who think that universal is not something that Africans buy into, here is one of the most important thinkers of the last century who is claiming for Africa that territory that people think they should yield to white people, to Caucasians, to Westerners, or whatever else you want to call them. And this is Césaire that people want to use to argue for decolonizing, because they just read some of them, take stuff out, and do not take them in the totality, of the ideas that they are selling. That was Aimé Césaire writing in 1955. Here is his colleague and collaborator, and sadly, the favorite whipping boy of our decolonizers, Leopold Sédar Senghor, speaking at the University of Cairo in 1967. I shall pause briefly at the philosophical and the religious levels. We shall note, first of all, the debt Hellenic thought owes to Egyptian thought, as attested by the Greek writers themselves, the greatest of whom is Plato. In commenting on Plato, the Egyptian Plotinus merely renders Africa its due, human reason, which has refound its autonomy to reach toward unity through love and the love of beauty. Without leaving Egypt, let us point out that it was in Alexandria that the foundations of the Christian conception of the world and the Trinity were cast in an African spirit. If the Romans had not destroyed the 700,000 volumes of the Alexandria library, no doubt the face of the world would have changed. But Berber land took up the torch with a pleiad of writers and thinkers, the greatest of whom was St. Augustine. Without the Africans, and especially St. Augustine, Christianity, under the influence of analytical reason, would have become, like Roman religion, a rational system of formulas and practices. It was the Bishop of Hippone who gave it its soul, its spirituality, by bringing it back to its Semitic roots. Thanks to the ideas rethought and relived of charity and the creative world, both of which are African. It was St. Augustine who effected the most dynamic symbiosis of discursive reason and intuitive reason. Quote, believe in order to understand, and understand in order to believe, end of quote. As Arab civilization moves closer toward the West, Morocco and Andalusia will continue the work of cultural emancipation and development. In the 12th century, the Cordovan Averroes, Ibn Rushd, will give us not only his famous Aristotelian commentaries, but also philosophy and theology, to which we must add the harmony between religion and philosophy. The role of Averroes in the liberation of Arab Berber thought is decisive, supported by the text of the Quran, which recommend the rational development of sciences and philosophy. He, following in the footsteps of Plotinus and St. Augustine, attempts a union of reason and faith. In a more definite, rigorous effort of thought, he tends toward a more radical intellectualism. He places himself beyond the physical in the metaphysical. And then he goes on to talk about Tertullian and other, fathers of the ancient church right there in North Africa, but I'm going to spare you, of those. There, in a capsule, is the history of what we facilely but problematically call, quote unquote, Western philosophy. The author fully cognizant of the many and diverse hands that had tilled its soil. Notice how Senghor wove into his description Asia, Africa, and Europe. And his account is based on very sound historical foundations. For example, the monastic tradition of the Catholic Church originated in the Sahara, migrated to Ireland, and descended into continental Europe over time. What does it say for our taking Africa's place in the global circuit of ideas to heart? Not to talk seriously when in a book titled The Age of Globalization, Anarchists and the Anti-Colonial Imagination by Benedict Anderson about the movement of ideas and its impact on late 19th century politics and culture, there is nary a mention of Africa. The book is a truly global enterprise connecting, quote, Europe, the Americas, and the anti-imperialist uprisings in Cuba, China, and Japan, end of quote. I do not want to insist that all historical events or trends are instantiated in every nook of the globe. And no, I do not know any quote unquote militant anarchists in Africa in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. There may have been, but given, as we argue below, how Africa is conceptualized in academia and the global imaginary generally, the presumption that Africa is not the kind of place where such discourses are to be found means that research in that direction will most likely be limited. That is, we may be surprised by what is there that has escaped our apprehension because we are not looking for it. Given what I know of the debates that went on within West Africa as just a small corner of the continent, regarding the self-same themes that Anderson's dramatis personae were preoccupied by and directed the self-same imperialists, including the emergent imperialist power of the day, Germany. It is significant how fleeting and tangential mentions of Africa are in the discussion. No blame lies with Anderson on this score. A perusal of MJC Echeruo's book, Victorian Lagos, and discourses of Pan-Africanism in the run-up to the inaugural Pan-African Conference in 1900 might show that Africa was not a mute presence in the discourses and migrating ideas of late 19th century global politics and culture. The same could be said of the perorations of scholars like Edward Wilmot Blyden, James Africanus Bill Horton, Alexander Cromwell, or George Ephraim Ferguson, writing in the same period. By the way, Cromwell and Blyden lived in Liberia at the same time, and they know each other, they interacted, they were friends. James Africanus Horton lived in Sierra Leone, and he and Blyden also knew each other and they were friends. And at a lecture that I'll be giving later in the year in Germany, I'm actually talking about the philosophy of history, their contributions on liberal education by these three men who never show up in the history of philosophy. And they were all operating in exactly the register that we want to throw out as Western philosophy. So they are orphaned by us and they are orphaned by their interlocutors. That's something that decolonizing does not allow us to get to, and I will explain why in a moment. How then do we make sense of how a continent that has always been, yes, always been a presence, often a significant one in globalization, however far back we go, is only now referenced as part of European and American, or lately, Asian shenanigans in global narratives? Here is an even more pressing motivation for the current engagement. I have been working for some time on modern African political philosophy. Now that I am officially a professor of African political thought, I am concerned to introduce graduate students to a tradition of philosophizing and thinking about social and political phenomena in Africa and get them down the road to contributing to the secondary discourse that the discipline will need to move forward and compel attention. Because I have always believed that philosophical questions are perennial and universal, only the answers being specific and parochial, I was interested in getting my students to see how these universal questions are conceived and processed in the discourse of political philosophy. Certainly, if political philosophical questions have no specific bylines and are generated only based on the complexity of the social formations and temporalities within which they arise, it will stand to reason that the annals of the discourse will reflect the global spread of their interlocutors. But I was taken aback by the severity of the absence of Africa in social and political philosophy. In fact, it became a teachable moment for me and my students. We looked at least 25 books I think they are closer to 40 for me, but 25 was what I shared with my students. A mixture of text and anthologies, and only 2 or 3 included Africa in any manner, shape, or form. One anthology has 1 chapter on India and 1 on Africa. In yet another context, having to do with another piece I did on philosophy and the state in post-colonial Africa, an anthology on the idea of freedom in Africa and Asia has 2 contributions on Africa and 1 on India. The entry on India is almost as long as the 2 pieces on Africa. More significantly, while the Indian writer of the piece on India did a robust exposition of the ideas of Ram Mohan Roy, I am not taking sides in internal debates about the relative importance of different demographics in Indian intellectual history. On the evolution of the modern idea of freedom in India, the authors of the 2 pieces on Africa only had room for what I call cameo appearances by African thinkers, and not for even, quote, a sliver of material from African thinkers' perorations on the matter of freedom. And from literature to politics to philosophy to history, the idea of freedom from the mid-19th century, and actually from the 18th century, if you throw in Olaida Equiano and Otoba Kugwano, has been a presence in African discourses, from back then. And of course, in the anti-colonial struggle and all that, freedom was there, not just in politics and all that. Our musicians wrote songs on freedom. They wrote calypso numbers on freedom. People sang in local languages on the need for freedom and the importance of freedom. But the annals of our discourse never show that freedom is something that agitates Africans, because Africans are not supposed to actually deal with such things. Africans are supposed to just deal with the belly, and freedom is sometimes regarded as a luxury that only intellectuals who are already well-fed will persuade themselves to think. But we see what is going on in Africa right now in what I call Africa's second struggle for freedom all across the continent. And again, we are not reflecting that in what we are writing. And our scholars are just telling young people what they need to do is to chase the latest slides from some person who may not even know Africa, but thinks he or she is an expert. As someone who has worked extensively in the area, including becoming a scholar of specific African thinkers, political philosophy, and here I claim to be a scholar of Cabral, Nyerere, Obafemi Awolowo, and Obafemi Awolowo is the one on whom I have written the most. I've published 4 papers on him, on his political philosophy, as we speak. And as far as I'm concerned, he's probably the most important political philosopher of the last century from Africa. Not Nkrumah, not Nyerere. It was Obafemi Awolowo. People may want to read him. I know that there is surely something there. If this were an isolated case, it would not pose a problem. But given that, as I just indicated, this is emblematic of how African contributions to discourses in which African scholars have been participants, the outcome, intended or otherwise, is the creation of a persistent impression, either that Africans have nothing to say about and have contributed nothing to those discourses, or what they contributed is not worth discussing, much less engaged by others. In other words, César's lament continues to resonate in our time. Today's students, future scholars, end up with exclusions that become self-reinforcing and self-fulfilling anticipations of nothing to be found there mentality when it comes to African intellectual exertions. Worse still, simultaneously with these elisions, there is an unseemly focus on negative phenomena, from the consecration of corruption as the most important issue to deal with in African life, to the obsession with Africa's pathologies, as if these are not indicated in other human settings, such that generations of scholars come to think that Africa is an intellectual wasteland. The good thing is that my students who took that class no longer need to think we cry wolf when we complain about the erasure of African intellectual production. Not only that, but they are also now able to decide for themselves why they think that African thinkers are not worthy of their attention. At least they know what it is that they don't like. They know where to look for those neglected bits of political philosophical wisdom and or idiocy in the African ideational world. I am suggesting that a Senghorian interlude, the capsule that I shared with you, an explication of the details and underlying assumptions of his account of the history of philosophy will reveal an Africa that has never been an absence in the constitution and operations of the global circuit of ideas. Unfortunately, the denizens of the decolonizing industry do not evince any understanding, not to talk of embrace, of this long history of African intellectual production. And here is where my strictures on decolonization too come into bolder relief. First, if, as is dominant in decolonization discourse, you embrace the bastard periodization under which there are only three periods in African history: pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. Many of what took place in the nebulous pre-colonial period are not likely to be legible to you for an additional reason that I state momentarily. Because Africa is often taken to be the unit of analysis, the business of drilling down to the granular details of what took place where, at particular times, the synchronous dimension is hardly attended to, and the evolution of some of those granular elements over time, the diachronous dimension, the many transformations that may have occurred to and within them, and to and within the societies, groups, and social formations in which they are to be found, hardly ever happens. This is why easy but uninformed generalizations dominate the discourse, and the asymmetries in the development of material and ideological culture across the continent are infrequently registered in African studies. Let me give you an example that I think made the most impression on a very dear colleague of mine. Every time you read something that says, in Lingala, so is X. The same is true of Yoruba, and the same is true. So I said, what's the basis of a comparison? How good is your Yoruba and how good is your Lingala? So if you don't have facility in both languages, how do you affirm equivalence in the meanings of the words if you do not already presume that in Africa, everything is the same? Nobody says, and there is a group of languages called the Romance languages, if I'm not mistaken. So nobody says something in Spanish and says, yeah, it's so in French also. You better know your French and you better know your Spanish. But in Africa, you can say that because everybody thinks that Africa is the unit of analysis and every part is just an instance of that common type. I have enough struggles trying to come up with decent translations from my original Yoruba inheritance. You think I'm going to tell you something about Edo? No, because I don't know anything about it. I have enough difficulty trying to walk through the Yoruba materials. This is what happens when you pay attention to and you give respect for the complexity of the reality you are trying to interpret. We don't do it enough in our line of work. The situation is not held by the full embrace of what I call the metaphysics of difference by decolonizers and much of the African studies community when it comes to describing and explaining African phenomena. To this end, we are living in very interesting times. These are times when, despite appearances to the contrary and clamorous protestations from many of us, binaries rule and ruin some of our noblest aspirations. We live in a time when binaries denominated by identity rule the roost. If you are North, you cannot be South. If you are African, you are, by definition, non-Western. If you subscribe to the very meaning of universal, the instantiations of which are forever seeking for adequation to it, you are an easy dupe of our colonizers who, despite their plurality, are forever represented and traduced in the singular. Sadly, this discourse is more productive of heat than it is of light. In my scholarly exertions, I have always stayed away from this well-beaten path. Every people claim the universal, just as every advanced civilization has a story of creation of the world and the humans that inhabit it. I never fail to let people know that the Yoruba story of creation is more accommodating and more sophisticated than the story in the Bible. And I always lay it out, for my students, when I teach them. When I make a case against erasure, it is not in the name of any identity, but in the name of an idea that many of us here and beyond can embrace: the production and dissemination of the best, most adequate, and most reflective of the human condition knowledge that we can muster. This being the goal of that ever-fleeting ideal of a liberal education for our time and our posterity. Affirmative answers to the question of why we should study and learn the ways of being human other than our own are, in fact, necessitated by the goal of education. The need to create educated folk imbued with an expansive sense of the human experience and trained to identify unifying themes in this experience through history. The more restricted the scope covered in the educational system, the less educated its products will be. There will be too many blind spots in the knowledge of the products of such an educational system. Teachers should not be in the business if they are not committed to providing their students with as wide a range of knowledge as is available to us at any particular time. The epithet universalist in these times is almost a four-letter word. And in our attempts to retire provincialism, the Euro-American kind, masquerading, often accompanied by an insufferable arrogance as universalism, we end up dissolving the very idea of the universal. That, I contend, is not merely a mistake. It is one with extremely dangerous implications for our very understanding of what it is to be human and for what binds us in that not always comfortable speciesdom that we call humanity. In trying to bring to our awareness in certain registers that have suffered unwarranted erasure, we back into an unwitting embrace of what I have in numerous writings dubbed the metaphysics of difference. This is the idea that Africans are so radically different from the general run of humanity that in talking about Africans and things African, we need a language other than that with which we routinely talk about the rest of the world. The absolute order has been laid to rest or at least muted in other areas. It is alive and kicking in African studies. It remains legal tender in much of African and Africanist scholarship about Africans and things African. And Africans are the guiltiest in peddling this myth. We are unlike Westerners. We are a different people. We are communal, they are individualist. The alibis proliferate. Acceptance of this undifferentiated generalization about what it is to be African has pernicious consequences, and one of them is to make easy the erasure that we talk about here in this presentation. It means that the heterogeneities domiciled in a continent are flattened into an uninteresting, definitely uninspiring caricature that people only entertain because they have embraced a simple view of Africa and its phenomena. It also means that the debates that have always characterized the continent ever since it was forced, yes, forced by outsiders to become aware of itself as possibly a unity. Here again, Africa is no different. If Hegel is to be believed, Europe's awareness of itself was not innocent of its contact with the Americas. Respecting what it is to be African and the rich history of discourses concerning this specific fact remain occluded from the purview of scholars, both indigenous and alien. A very quick historical example. At the 1945, Pan-African Congress, one of the issues or the division between many from French West Africa and African Americans, because many of them from French West Africa refused to acknowledge that African Americans were still Africans. So when we then pretend that to be African is African, is African, is African, and we ignore many of these debates, and they are debates. I'm not just talking of cleavages, I'm talking of people having reasons why they want to go in one way or the other. It's also when people talk about Senghor's reason is Hellenic, emotion is African. 20-something years before Senghor wrote that, another African thinker, Kobina Sechi is his pen name, from Ghana, actually wrote in 1917. He said, thinking, I'm trying to get his word, is African, impulse is European. Because he said, Europe was young when Africa was old, and wisdom, of course, you attach to age. Now, I don't care if people want to scold Senghor, but don't take him as representing Africa, because between him and Kobina Sechi, there's already a divide where they are saying the exact opposite, what the other is saying. Let's talk about that. That is how we pay attention to the complexity of thinking, in the continent. Let me go to I have a few more others, but the end of this is really what I would like to share with us before my time is out. Okay. I end on a debate between two of the world's most important thinkers, who also happen to be writers and Africans in the area of ethics, and who, by the way, are also interlocutors in a debate on identity that took place in the last century, Senghor and Wole Soyinka. For those who are familiar with Soyinka, he was the one who wrote that against negritude, that a tiger does not advertise its tigritude. And that was his knock on Senghor and those who are doing negritude back in the day. He did revise himself later on. Those of you who read his myth literature, The African World, will see. But even more important is his book, The Burden of Memory and the Muse of Forgiveness. And this, the note I want to conclude on. Senghor wrote a poem titled Prayer for Peace. Let me read to you the opening of that poem. Prayer for Peace, for organs. Lord Jesus, at the end of this book, which I offer you as a ciborium of sufferings, at the beginning of the great year, in the sunlight of your peace, on the snowy roofs of Paris. Yet I know that my brother's blood will once more redden the yellow Orient on the shore of the Pacific, ravaged by storms and hatred. I know that this blood is the spring libation the great tax collectors have used for 70 years to fatten the empire's lands. Lord, at the foot of this cross, and it's no longer you, tree of sorrow, but above the old and new worlds, crucified Africa. And her right arm stretches over my land, and her left side shades America, and her heart is precious Haiti, Haiti who dared proclaim man before the tyrant. At the feet of my Africa, crucified for 400 years, and still breathing, let me recite to you, Lord, for her prayer of peace and pardon. Lord God, forgive white Europe. Now, Soyinka talked about that poem in the context of his discussion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And as somebody who has always worked at the risk of his life for justice everywhere in the world, especially in Africa and definitely in his homeland, Nigeria, on one hand, he wants to forgive. On the other hand, he thinks that those who have done crimes should receive their just desert, and that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the kind of forgiveness that Senghor has in mind, will not do for him. So what does he do with it? Soyinka was troubled by the idea of the TRC in its reconciliation movement, forgiving crimes and allowing perpetrators to escape their just desert. I don't want to hold you for much longer. While Soyinka would like to see perpetrators receive their desert, he eventually came to see that that may not always be optimal for the societies concerned and for the progress of humanity on balance. Soyinka, who is genuinely invested in the exigencies of the human condition, exemplified by both the descent into ignominy by the Chartering Society that creates Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and simultaneously to locate the cause of that descent and the forestalling of any future reoccurrence. He struggles mightily with the three alternatives he identifies as possible responses by societies that have fallen into that hole. One, naked revenge. Two, strike a TRC that runs the risk of allowing some of the perpetrators of the most egregious crimes to escape their just desert. Three, a modified TRC that expands to include both retribution and reparation. He asks, quote, how on earth does one reconcile reparations or recompense with reconciliation or remission of wrongs? Dare we presume that both, in their different ways, are committed to ensuring the righting of wrongs and the triumph of justice? Having witnessed to his chagrin the sanguinary, revenge-driven settling of scores in Ghana, and he was present when all those army officers and other people were killed after the overthrow of Ignatius Kutu Achampong, in Ghana, for people just baying for blood of those who have destroyed the country. Soyinka was not inclined to contemplate that as the way to go for a society that has fallen short. Quote, in the end, one was left to wonder, in hindsight, if the approach of a truth and reconciliation, albeit with some fundamental changes in the essentials, something closer to truth and restitution, would not have served the Ghanaian populace better. And eventually, he embraced the idea of a TRC because he said, after such a commission was set up in Uganda to investigate the regime of Idi Amin and bring out the truth of what really happened to people, he then realized that in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the more immediate, important part of that framing is the truth. You can have the truth without reconciliation, but you can never have reconciliation without truth. And that, as I'm speaking to you, and as somebody who just finished a book on whether or not the United States needs a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I have never seen anybody cite Soyinka in their discourse of truth and reconciliation, even as I speak. That tells you everything you need to know about how people take African ideas, even when the issues are still breaking. Thank you all for your patience. I'm very grateful.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Taiwo, for a very interesting, stimulating lecture, just as we expected. Much to talk about, much to think about, some nice provocations in there. This is the moment where you get the chance to ask your questions, and we have put the microphone in the middle of the room. I realize that is a little bit intimidating, but that is not the intention. What we ask you to do is to take your place behind the microphone, kindly introduce yourself, and then ask your questions or offer your reflections. So it's always the tense moment of who wants to go first. But here we see, and maybe while we wait for people behind there, maybe I shall just ask you, I had so many questions after I read the book, but one of the things that keeps coming up, I kept thinking when I was listening to you again, to one of the Nigerians that you do not cite very often, Chinua Achebe, which says, who says very clearly in so many of his writings, we live at the crossroads of cultures. And I think your reading of modernity and Achebe's hybridity, or the crossroad of cultures, is something that I would like you to speak a little bit more about in your own approach to your scholarship. So while I'll let Professor Taiwo answer that question, then give him something to think about, or you all something to think about. But you can form a nice British queue, if you like, behind the first questioner, and then we'll probably take 2 or 3 questions at a time. So we'll continue in that manner.
Thank you very much. Yes, Achebe actually belongs to that group with Soyinka, and the rest of them, who pushed back against the demand that African literature can only be written in African languages. And Achebe just takes a very pragmatic, approach to it. But and you're very correct, part of the appeal of Achebe for me, and I've done some other work on him, especially teasing out a philosophy of history from Things Fall Apart. Everybody reads it as a novel of encounter. And I'm saying, no. If you look at the structure of the book, the most important things that happened had happened before the white people got there. And again, with my preoccupation with agency, to now think that it was the missionaries getting there that upset everything is really to not take seriously all the things that are taking place in that society before white people got there. So Achebe always, and in one of his most remarkable interviews, actually said that he had been influenced mostly and inspired by, this is very interesting, Joseph Conrad, the same one that he, polemicized against, and Tennyson. And that's very fascinating. And this is again what I say about decolonizing, okay? So why can an Achebe not go wherever in the world he wants to find his inspiration and domesticate it for his own ends? Why does that make him a diminished thinker? Because he finds things from other humans, that he wants to use. No, I don't think that we should really encourage that kind of thinking. And we can talk about how badly or how well they have domesticated what they have, And sometimes, even if all people want to do is to mimic, what they are saying, yes, mimicry does not mean that the mimic does not contribute anything to the performance. So, so that's the reason why, but yes, you are right. He falls within that category, and he embraced, the modern idea very clearly.
Yes, please. Please feel free to ask your question, pose your question, and if you could kindly introduce yourselves, and if there are more people, please form an orderly queue. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so my name is, good evening. My name is Fejiro. Yeah, I'm Nigerian too. So first of all, thank you. I found your talk extremely interesting, really stimulating, and it's not something I hear often. So I was extremely excited to come, and I was extremely glad that I did come and I heard everything that you had to say. With that in mind, I have 3 questions, but they're linked. I can really just sum it up into one. First off, at the university, recently we've had a lot of talk about knowledge production and who gets to produce the knowledge, who decides what knowledge is produced, and who is in charge of that process. And I could really just link it to what you were saying about the minimization of African thinkers. And I was wondering, firstly, and most importantly, if there is a solution to that problem, is there a way that African thinkers can be elevated and brought to the spotlight, especially now that we're talking about knowledge production? Secondly, if that solution is possible with the current way the continent is, because when we say Africa, I just want, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the continent itself? Are we talking about Africa and diaspora? Because it's a really, like you said, it's a really complex, really complicated issue. You have so many divisions. You have people who would say that sub-Saharan Africans are different from the Northern Africans, and they don't really consider Northern Africans Africans because they're closer to the Middle East and the Arabs than sub-Saharan Africa. You would say that, you would see people who say that the diaspora in places like Haiti and Latin America are not really African just because you have this cultural integration that's not what you're used to from home. You also have people who will say that if you didn't live in the continent, maybe you migrated with your family when you were 2 or you were 6, or maybe you were born outside the continent, they would say, oh, you're not African, you're whitewashed, let's call it that way. So when you have so many divisions amongst people who are supposed to unite and solve this problem together, how do you solve the problem? I guess that's really my question. So how do you solve a problem of knowledge production when the people who are supposed to be coming together to solve the problem are so divided?
Wonderful. We'll take the next question as well, if that is okay. Thank you, please.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Yeah, maybe coincidentally and by chance of this lineup, I am ranking again behind the last question person as a Nigerian also. We are asking our own Nigerian scholar here, and then it's an African, so we know what we are trying to say here. Yeah, you have, I'm a doctoral student in international development. I'm curious to know what this argument, bringing this argument to the altar of truth and reconciliation. Africa does not understand itself, and then African scholars are consigned to the fringe of the global intellectual debate. Where do you position and how do you reconcile the underdevelopment that Africa has been webbed in century knowledge production, intellectual debate, and African having to understand itself? Where you present this? How do you reconcile this? What do you think can make Africa better in practical terms, in terms of intellectual debate, in terms of Africa understanding itself, in terms of Africa transforming its own landscape to something tangible, something that we can point at, something that can be more meaningful to the world, that can make the world know that, yes, Africa is beginning to understand itself. And then the second one is, this argument is scholarly. What would you like to leave behind in practical terms as a transformation legacy in African and to African scholars and the young ones for us like per se? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll let you answer those 2 questions. I do not know if this microphone, yes, it does work. Yes, you can hear me. Excellent. So while Professor Taiwo answers those 2 questions, I invite you again to take your positions behind the microphone, and we'll come to those next. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for those 2 very interesting questions. To the first one, let me just put it this way. Please personally, I do not do any identity at all. And my students asked me in class this week, you don't do identity, but you are Yoruba, I said, yes, I am. But this is where the difference is. There is no natural identity. Someday I will write a paper about this. All identities are contingent. And it occurred to me one morning this week after that class, when people go to Romania to adopt babies, are they adopting Romanian babies or they're adopting babies born in Romania who are going to be brought up American? And if Romanian identity is natural to those children, would we be changing them, when we bring them to be raised, or we go adopt babies from Korea and then we raise them, in Canada, are they Korean babies, So if you understand that identities could be otherwise than they are for anybody at any place, then you are not going to get yourself arrested by people who want to tell you these are the hoops you have to jump through in order for you to be an African. So my answer to them is when they say, oh, but you are not African, so I tell them, keep the label, I'll take the ideas. I don't have to be African. I can be anything else as long as I'm a good person, a good human. But I am African because that's my inheritance, which is quite contingent, is quite accidental. I was born there, I was raised there, and all that. But am I going to use that as something that would not allow me to embrace any other part of the human experience that sits well with me? You can bet your bottom dollar it's not going to happen to this one. So for me, that's what I tell my students. That's what I tell my younger people, get a grip on what you want to be, get good at it, get yourself bloody educated about whatever it is that you want to get into, and make sure that nobody can trash you just because of your choice. End of story. In terms of knowledge production and all that, yes, ask your teachers the tough questions. When I teach philosophy, I tell my students, you have been hard. Because when I tell them this story about how, different people have contributed to what you call Western philosophy, and they don't all look the same way, then when you get to your next class and they give you the story of one dimension, you should ask them, but I read that so and so. So let your teacher justify to you why they're telling you a one-dimensional story of a very complex reality. And it doesn't have to be adversarial. So they may have very good arguments for why they think that the contributions of Equiano do not belong, that you can teach liberalism, without teaching Frederick Douglass, I mean, those are the kinds of things that I want to empower my students to be able to do. I am not interested in identity. I'm not interested in, excoriating people and all that. I just want to expand my students so that they have more pieces to play with, in the game of the mind. In terms of practical terms, I have to address that specifically. I'm sorry, I don't do practice. I'm a teacher. Okay? If I want to go into policy, if I want to go into politics and all that, yes, that will, but I want to be sure, because all of you are students here, you are going to be running my life in another 10 years, if not less than that. So while I have you, I really want to be sure that I am persuaded that I've done the most I can with you, so that when I enter traffic court and you are sitting behind that big chair, I can be sure that you know what you're doing. So that is the only way that I can influence policy, so that when all of you work for, development ministry, and so on and so forth, you have the proper education that will enable you to embrace the fullness of the human experience and not fall short in terms of the multiplicity or the ways of being human. If your education is not doing that for you, I don't know what you're paying for. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please.
Hello. It's a very sensitive microphone. Thank you, Professor, for being here, and thank you for your words and your work. My name is Mark, and I have two questions for you. One for you as a philosopher, and another in the spirit of international policy. The philosophical question is, which you maybe alluded to, in your previous answer just now. You mentioned that you take the philosophical questions to be perennial, but the answers to be contingent. I was hoping you could elaborate on the relationship between the concepts of modernity and universalism, and specifically how you take universalism in its contingent form. And the question regarding international policy, I wondered if you had given thought to Haiti's role in the, I don't really know what to call it, but in the thesis of non-Pan-Africanism, in dynamic Africanism, given its, not given the sensationalism that it kind of has in the past year, but outside of it being historically rooted in that struggle. I wondered if you could give an idea of what your conception is of it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Williams. Professor Taiwo, thank you. You've given us a wonderful account of many of the things that have been effaced from the world of ideas. I want to invite you to speak some more about where you began, which was an attack on what you called decolonialism 2. And I want to know a little bit more about, because this is the decolonialism that most of us are familiar with in the contemporary university. And it's one, having read your book, that I know that you are extremely hostile towards. And I'd like to invite you to speak to the audience a little bit more about exactly what is wrong with decolonialism 2. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sandra. I have two questions. I was wondering, do you believe that the anti-colonial movement of the 1900s are intentionally different than modern decolonization movements? And if it is necessary to completely do away with the decolonial mindset, or rather to nurture the new movement with mentalities of Micho Inca, for example. And my next question was, you mentioned the Global Pan-African Conference in 1945 when French West Africans would not or didn't want to acknowledge African Americans as Africans. Do you see that as a form of tribalism? And in your opinion, does the decolonial movement lean into colonial identities of self rather than affirm one's own identity?
Thank you very much. Let me start with the last question. No, I don't think that there's a colonial identity and then some other identity. You know, in the colonial moment, there were many identities. You know, there were people who thought that the ways of the colonizers were the way that they want to go. There were people who said we should go back to our original, whatever it is, however they understood that. There were people who said, yeah, we want to preserve much of what we had and a little bit of the new one. There were people who said, we want to take all of the new one with a little bit of what we had. Right there, you have 4, 5, 6 different, combinations, of people. My point is, don't let's reduce all of them to one and then say that that is the authentic one. Okay? And how people want to perform this will depend on how they are able to explain all this to themselves and what combination they will come up with, So for those who think that diasporic Africans were no longer African, remember that is based on an assumption that they have already patented what it is to be African. Okay? Why will anybody allow anybody to do that? Because the same people who are saying that within Africa will then look at some other groups outside of themselves and say, you are not African enough because you've been hanging out, Meanwhile, many of those people who are saying that were actually people who are operating in French. So you begin to see all kinds of ironies and sometimes, inconsistencies. And my point is that those of us who are scholars, we should never allow ourselves to be overtaken, so that we question everything. And what answers we're going to give, I want to remain loose about those boundaries. I hope that that makes sense, to you. The decolonization, so this now takes me to, Professor Williams's question. The reason why I think decolonization too is so pernicious, okay, is that it says that anything that has even a whiff of colonialism should be dispensed with. Now, one of the beautiful things about being human is that humans have this capacity for always breaking the boundaries of meaning. I'll use the example of slavery, okay? Slave owners were absolutely sure that the people they enslaved in the US were things. But I don't think that enslaved persons ever saw themselves as things. So what did they do? The same principles that Jefferson declared, all men are created equal. The enslaved persons looked at it and said, oh, we like that idea, by the way. Do you mind? And of course, Jefferson could not handle that. The slave owners could not handle that. But they could not put a cap on who could interpret what they have announced. Once they announced it, it was no longer theirs. Anyone who was willing to put in the sweat equity to learn it became a part owner of it. So by the same token, when colonizers said, oh, we came to civilize you, and then they switched, where people said, oh, by the way, we actually love civilization. All those who love civilization were put in jail. Then that's why they started rehabilitating chieftaincies, some of which are already moribund. In my part of Nigeria, chiefs no longer meant anything because things that happened, that had really made them disreputable. What did the colonial authorities do? They started giving them powers that they did not even have indigenous modes of governance. Because that was their answer to those Africans who said, this modern thing really strikes us as something that we can use. And as a result of that, since you said no one should be governed by a government in the constitution of which she does not have a hand, you have no legitimacy here. How dare you? They send them to jail. Okay? Now, when people now say that all that stuff is Western, one, all the Africans who have embraced that and made it their own, then become illegible to our young students. And what do they replace with it? They say, oh, we have to look for African things. Is there any society that has existed for thousands of years where anything stays the same? So what is it that is going to be African that you're going to go look for that you cannot see has been affected by all kinds of influences depending on where it is located? In the case of West Africa, think of it. Ancient Ghana is actually closer to where what we call Western Sahara is now. And that place was closer to Spain, to the Iberian Peninsula, than it is to my hometown in Nigeria. And now you want to tell me that, whatever was African then was purely African. It did not have Islam. It did not have Christianity. These were all people who were exchanging, signing agreements and so on and so forth over centuries. That cannot be good scholarship. I'm sorry. So the identity may suit you, but I think you are actually doing young people very bad by saying that that is what they should be looking for. And then you begin to look at music, and so on and so forth. Look, African musicians did not start saying, oh, the piano is a Western instrument, okay? They started making the piano say things that they want to say in African. So they domesticated it. A Nigerian, classical scholar, and composer actually created a genre of classical music that they call African pianism. Let's go study it. And then the young man was just consecrated a star in the Paris Ballet, okay? After a performance of, it's escaping me now, in South Korea. The young man is half Senegalese, half French. What is natural about that? So if he could get into those moves and be able to impress people enough and so on, it just tells you that the human is infinitely capable, So we do have a Ugandan now who is a top Buddhist monk. So if a Nigerian can be a cardinal, why can't a white European who is willing to pay the sweat equity become a babalawo in my original religion? I don't see any problem there. That's what I mean. And I don't want young people to be foreclosed from taking the world as their school and going out to study based on what they desire. And there's no way that Africa can ever lose from such an expansive understanding of human possibilities. That's really my argument. Modernity and universalism. Think of it. Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. When slave owners say that that is not something that enslaved persons have, they surprise them. Okay? When Alexander Cromwell would not be admitted to college in the United States, he went to Cambridge and got himself a doctorate in divinity. Hello? He became a co-owner. That's it. So what sets modernity apart for me, and I'm always saying this to students in my classes, is that it was the first time in human history that the self was brought out as not attached to anything. For the Greeks, the individual was always born tribalized. In medieval society, and in other aristocratic societies across the world, you are part of your tribe, you are part of, then these guys came out and said, you are you. Ever since, how do you talk about universal human rights and not talk in terms of that singular individual whose interest must be protected against pressures of tribe, of state, of fellow human beings? And that does not come with any adjective based on geography, based on language. That's my argument. And I want people to take that seriously. Thanks.
Thank you. We are coming close to when we have to close, but I am going to take the two questions that have been patiently waiting. So please, if you can keep it slightly short, that would be appreciated so we don't get thrown out of the room.
Yes,
Thank you.
I'll keep it short. Hi, my name is Carissa, and my question is about the relationship about reconciliation and academia in Africa. So you were talking about earlier how, unfortunately, African philosophy is not taken seriously in the Western world, whereas in America, let's say. And I wanted to know how reconciliation could affect the integrity of academia, and if that would probably be influenced because of the history of Africa, actually, because you said earlier as well how Africa has a very long, extensive history. However, I believe that nowadays it's kind of taken aside because of the decolonization that's been taking place, and now Africa has a new history and it's kind of a new nation and reinventing itself in modern times. So to me, it seems as if that the modernity of Africa is what's taking away its legitimacy in academia. Do you believe that reconciliation and recognizing the newity of Africa would make it more legitimate in terms of academic integrity?
Hi, my name is Nusha, and I study political anthropology at Carleton University. Currently taking an ethnography of sub-Saharan Africa class, where we're reading The Invention of Africa by Mudembe. And we recently, in one of our classes, came across an article by, I hope I'm saying this name right, Oyo Wufmi, who wrote about the Oyo Yoruba understanding of gender and hierarchy. So in this article, she mentions that in Yoruba culture, you do not have a significant understanding of gender being hierarchical, but rather age being hierarchical. And so in the context of modernity, and what you wrote about in your book, Elite Capture, I wanted to ask the question, does Western liberal discourse of gender identity make sense for the African context? Or is this just another version of elite capture?
That's it. Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you very much. A correction. There are two of us. There are two Olufemi Taiwos. The other one is the author of Elite Capture. So for a change, I will tell him, so it has always been weighted in his favor, people attributing my writings to him. So I will tell him, I got one back on you. So yes, thank you very much. But he's at Georgetown University, and I tell people, he's the future. I'm done. So doing good work. But we do happen to have, in fact, recently he and I took part in a conversation on Cabral for the History of Philosophy podcast. The organizers of the podcast were making mischief. So because they keep getting things from people mixing us and all. And they said, would you guys, so I said, he first said, if the elder one, that's what he calls me. And I said, what is all this about Pliny? For crying out loud, but anyway, but thank you. Yes, Oyewumi's book, Oyewumi is also a personal friend, and we go way back. We argue about it all the time. She's right in the claim that age is more salient in Yoruba culture than gender. Absolutely. But I think it's problematic to say that there is no hierarchy between the male and female in the culture. But again, in fact, I'm glad you brought that up because he and I represent examples of the kinds of debates that I'm encouraging all of you to engage in. We go back and forth. We disagree violently about this, but we respect each other's work. And we are asking other people to decide who has the better argument, but not to think that there's only one way of being Yoruba. That's the key point here. So there is any number of ways, of being Yoruba. So nobody has a patent on what Yoruba identity is. That's the first one. With the question of reconciliation, I try not to get worried about what people are writing, how they are seeing us and all that. My own point always is do your work, serve your audience. The fact that all these countries in Africa are recent creations does not mean that we can still not do the long view of history. We cannot do them because there's no long history of Nigeria, but there's a long history of Oyo. Okay, there's a long history of Kano. So let us go on and do the 1,000 years of Kano's history. And let us, in doing that history, take very seriously the fact that Islam is at least 1,000 years old in Kano. And we then begin to look at the writings of Islamic scholars and then see what Islamic scholars from Kano have contributed to the global circuit of ideas from within their Islamic inheritance. I do know for a fact that as far back as the 15th century, there were scholars from Katsina in northern Nigeria who were in Aleppo, Syria, who were in Damascus, Now, when you now allow yourself to be arrested by the colonial, then you are never likely to be able to go that far back. That's part of what I'm complaining about. And I want all this to be on the table. The colonial, as I wrote in my book, and as one of Africa's top historians said, is a mere episode in African history. There is no part of Africa where colonialism lasted more than 100 years. No part of Africa, don't take my word for it, go check it. So how then do you turn that episode into the framework for how you understand the evolution of a continent that is supposed to be the oldest of all of them? That doesn't make any sense. And that's what I'm saying. Please, let colonizers or whatever it is, the racists and all that, let their dead bury their dead. You go right ahead and do your own work. So that's why you're not going to find, in all my years as a scholar, I've never written a rejoinder to any one of them because I don't have any respect for them. I just do my work and let, as you have all done tonight, decide whether or not I reward you with what I do. I'm not looking for the honorifics of the racket. So what if I don't get invited to something? Yeah, sometimes you invite me, I don't go. As we say in my original language, if somebody is eating because you're supposed to invite somebody to come eat with you, just as a matter of courtesy. But sometimes, you know, people really don't want, and then they start copying an attitude. So in my language, they tell you, if the person who's eating sees me and begins to wear a frown, I just tell them, I'm really not hungry. So that way, I completely take away from them whatever it is that they think they have on me. I do my work, I don't waste my energy, and I tell my students, those that work with me and all that, chart your path, do your work, put the best food that you are capable of cooking intellectually before the world, and your reward will find you. That's really, you know, but on a final note, I'd wanted to mention this. The idea of sub-Saharan Africa is one of those problematic ideas that people buy into that we should get rid of. Believe it or not, it was not created by Africans. It was created by Hegel. And the reason he created it was because he could not on one hand say that Africa had never been a part of history, while at the same time explaining Egypt's presence in Africa. So what he said was, Egypt is not in what he called Africa proper. And he said, and I quote, Egypt properly should be located in what he called European Africa. And I said, by the same token, Sicily, properly speaking, should be located in African Europe. End of story. Africa is one. The reason why I cited that piece from Senghor about Christianity in Africa and so on and so forth, Christianity is not a foreign religion to Africa. The Apostle Mark lived for years in Alexandria after the crucifixion. So what are people talking about? And Islam was in Africa, you know, in no time at all after its founding. And one of the principal counselors of the Holy Prophet, peace be on him, was a Black person. The man who helped the Lord Christ carry his cross on the road to Golgotha was Simon the Cyrene. Where are Cyrenians from? Cyrenaica. Where is Cyrenaica? Benghazi. And people want to, so that's the only way that they can then say that all that stuff was not African. And in 2011, after the Arab African Spring started, at a town hall meeting in Seattle, I went there and I said, oh, the Arab African Spring, there was a gasp in the audience. And I said to them, the last time I looked, Tunisia was still in Africa. Again, don't take my word for it. There's a record of this on the internet. Go check it. So my job when I teach students and all that is really to say to people, be careful what you allow yourself to believe. Don't trust me. We, your teachers, were always trying to sell you something. You should be very, very suspicious. And if you are not, hey, you've been had. Thank you.
Thank you all. Michael Williams began by saying that we have these lecture series because ideas matter. I think what we've heard tonight is that African ideas in all their diversity and complexity matters. And I want to thank you once again, Professor, for coming to CIPS, for coming to Ottawa, and for sharing your ideas with us. Thank you.